Good to see you.
You too. I have my camera on now.
I know, I love it. That's what I was saying. It's good to see you.
It's good to
It
see you
makes
too.
it makes such a big difference. My lit classes, like half the class is on video, and it's like it feels more like we're in class together. It's nice.
Aw, yeah, my other class doesn't do it. Everyone's off, so I'm just
Mhm.
used to having my camera off.
I also feel like I pay attention better when the
Yeah.
camera's on. It's like I'm accountable.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because in most of my classes, usually there'll be about, two or three students that'll have their cameras on and the rest will have their cameras off. And obviously, as far as I'm concerned, it's fine either way, especially, if students are having to, you know, to dial in via their phone.
Mhm.
Sometimes the visual becomes kind of a problem. And if I've had students have to say, it's not quiet in my house. The only place I could listen is sitting in my car and stuff like
Right.
that. So, but I really do love having at least a few people with the video on because again, it makes me feel like I'm in class and it makes me, it just reminds me who I'm talking to, which I really
Totally.
appreciate because it gets a little anonymous sometimes, if everybody is, audio only. So there you go. Well, anyway, good morning and welcome. Just to make sure that we all remember what day it is. Well, obviously you do if you're here because it's Friday. It is Friday, the 1st of May. It is May Day around the world. And wow, we got through another month successfully.
It's crazy.
The first, 100-day April in the history of the world. At least it felt like 100 days, right? So I'm really happy to have you all join me here today. This is really one of the highlights of my week, getting to talk with you and see you. And again, it does make me feel like, we're back on the second floor of the T building, doing what we like to do. So this morning, several things we want to do. First of all, just to go ahead and remind you about, if you need to contact me at any time during the week, the various ways that you can do that. Also, then to go ahead and take any last minute questions that you have about the topic that we went over last week, dealing with the presidency. Because remember, your discussion forum post on the presidency is due tonight at 11:59 p.m., not counting, of course, the 3-day grace period that we have for all of our assignments this semester. And then we'll spend the rest of our time today talking a little bit about the next assignment that will be due next Friday at 11:59 p.m., as always, then the magic hour in Canvas. And that is the last of the 3 national government branches, the judiciary. And I do apologize. When I logged on to our page this morning, I realized that Canvas did not do what it was supposed to do. It was supposed to post the notes for the judiciary section into the modules page and bring the module live last night. It didn't do it. I apologize. So I heard that's why those of you who were here right, a couple of minutes early, that's why I was, hurriedly, working on stuff. I was opened up that module, made sure the notes were up there and that sort of thing. So I apologize for that. Canvas is great when it works. I'll go ahead and give you kind of a general overview of the judiciary notes, and we'll go from there. And I'm guessing that will fill our time quite nicely, as it always tends to. So anyway, just to get started, again, it is lovely to see you all here today. And as always, if you need to talk to me about anything going on either with the class or with your life at LBCC in general, or with your life in general, please always feel free to reach out to me at any time during the week. Obviously, easiest ways to do that are by Canvas message and email. Also, of course, you can go ahead and visit with me one-on-one during my virtual student hours. Remember, those are twice a week, Monday and Wednesday afternoons from 2:30 until 3:30 in Pacific Daylight Time. And if you want to visit me during those virtual student hours, the Zoom link and the password for those virtual student hours are listed on our Canvas homepage for our class. If you scroll down past the picture to the basic course information section, you will find both the Zoom link and the password there. So please feel free to utilize that. And of course, if you want to talk to me one-on-one via Zoom, but those times on Monday and Wednesday afternoons don't work for you, please just send me an email or a Canvas message and we can set up a Zoom appointment for us to talk one-on-one. And I am always happy to do that. So please, do not hesitate to talk to me about anything that comes up that you think that I can help you with. And, just a reminder that if you have an assignment coming due in this class and you know that you are not going to be able to get that assignment posted onto Canvas even by the end of the 3-day grace period, please do let me know. Please send me a Canvas message or an email, whatever. Just get in contact with me and we will figure out a solution. Because, obviously my ultimate goal every semester in this class, but especially in this really wacky semester that we are dealing with, I want all of you to be successful. And I know that there are lots of stuff, unpredictable stuff going on in your lives from day to day and week to week. So if you have problem meeting a due date, even with the grace period, please let me know. We'll figure it out because, in the end, I want your success. So there you go. And I see a message in the group chat from Sean Anthony saying there's no password required if you go through Canvas. Zoom is being really weird about this because they changed their policy a number of weeks ago. And right after they changed the policy, students who didn't have a password were locked out. They couldn't get into these weekly Zoom meetings. I had one of my other Poli-Sci 1 classes where, the Zoom starts and I hadn't been informed of the policy changed and there's no one on the Zoom. No one showed up for the entire period. So I'm thinking, okay, what is going on? That's weird. And then emails start coming in saying I'm locked out. I can't get in. It's asking for a password. I don't know what's going on. So, I don't know what Zoom is doing right now, but what I will always do is I will go ahead and post the password for each weekly meeting in our Canvas announcements, just in case, because I don't want you suddenly to find yourself locked out. So if you can get in without a password, that's great, but know that you'll always have the password available as a backup, just in case, because I don't want you to miss out. And selfishly, I don't want to miss out on having you guys in the Zoom as well. So there you go. So before we do anything else, are there any questions about anything having to do with the class, upcoming assignments, the Student's Choice Project, anything at all before we go ahead and get going with kind of the regular agenda for the morning? Anybody?
I was really disturbed by the articles that we read in the Atlantic and Vox about the president. I'm so uneducated with respect to like the structure of the government and the way that things work. And I was really sort of surprised and disturbed, like I said before, by what exactly a president has the capacity to do if he declares it a state of emergency, especially given who our president is.
Fair enough.
That was really interesting. I was like, whoa, this is
and honestly, because those pieces are a little older at this point, and it's interesting. I was actually on a Zoom yesterday, and I'm hoping that and it was a presentation put forth by the UCLA Hammer Museum in Westwood. And I'm hoping that they say that they're going to be posting the recording of that Zoom in the next couple of days. And as soon as they do, I will go ahead and send you all the link as a Canvas announcement. It's not a required assignment or anything like that. But if you were interested, it was a really great discussion. It was part of a regular program that they do at the Hammer that they call Constitution Happy Hour. And so what they would do, I think it was once a month or something like that, back before the quarantine and the shelter in place orders came in and that sort of thing, is they would have these monthly get-togethers for like an hour actually inside the Hammer Museum. It was actually a happy hour. The Hammer, I don't know if you've ever been there, the Hammer has a really nice restaurant and bar kind of in the central atrium of the museum. And so people would get together and, you know, they'd have happy hour specials and that sort of thing. And they would discuss some aspect of the Constitution. And so they did the first virtual Constitution happy hour yesterday afternoon. And the featured expert is a really good friend of mine, Jessica Levinson, who teaches law at Loyola Law School. And if you are a public radio devotee here in Los Angeles, she has a regular Monday afternoon appearance on the Press Play show with Madeline Brand on KCRW. And she and Madeline just launched a podcast this week. I'll send you the information for that as well, dealing with contemporary legal issues in the United States in an age of quarantine. It's a really good series. But anyway, the subject of that last night is they were looking at what the Constitution says about the government's powers to, you know, order quarantines and sheltering in place and closing beaches and other public spaces and that sort of thing. Because as we know, as we've talked about in this Zoom class meeting over the past couple of weeks, there have been a growing number of protests in a lot of cities across the United States, and certainly in a number of places here in Southern California, you know, protesting the fact that in a lot of places, these shelter in place orders are still in place. People are being told, stay in your homes, except for going out for essential services such as grocery shopping and that sort of thing. And there is this movement, which appears to be mainly centered amongst white conservatives, saying, you know, the government is abusing its authority in doing this. And there's one really rather jarring image from one of these protests that I saw that I think starting during my summer session classes, I'm going to use that photo as the basis for a discussion forum post assignment. It's this message written on the rear window of a car that says, my liberties are more important than your health. And I saw that image and I just was like, okay. But it really does open up a really important question, kind of talking about, remember our first major course theme at the beginning of the semester, dealing with freedom versus order in the United States. And so because of images like that, at the happy hour last night from the Hammer, Professor Levinson talked about this specifically and went over the various elements within the Constitution that give primarily state governments the ability to, ramp up their police powers in situations like this. Because remember, and she talked about federalism. I was thinking back to our early discussions of that back when we were still face-to-face in this class. And remember what we said, that the national government has most of the authority and the state governments kind of get the leftover powers. And the leftover powers come through the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, the Reserve Powers Clause, right? And remember, I told you when we talked about this, and it's in our notes from federalism, I said that the most substantial powers that state governments get via the 10th Amendment is the ability to pass laws to regulate health and safety in the states. And that is specifically where the state's police power comes in. And so she was talking about the fact that, you know, a number of organizations have filed various suits against various state governments, saying that the states are exceeding their authority in this area. Especially, I heard there was a lawsuit filed just yesterday on behalf of, in response to Governor Newsom's order specifically to reclose beaches in Orange County because, Orange County went ahead and reopened their beaches about a week and a half ago. And because it was so hot last week, Orange County beaches were flooded with people who were not maintaining social distance and all that sort of thing. And so apparently initially this week, Governor Newsom initially thought about closing all beaches in the state. And he realized that was probably excessive. His advisors probably said, that's going to open up a whole can of worms. So the idea was focus on those areas where there was the most abuse. And Orange County was kind of the center of this. And so he went ahead and specifically reclosed beaches in Orange County. So a lawsuit's already been filed against him. And as Professor Levinson talked about yesterday, and I'm right with her on this, that given the nature of the police power and given precedent in the Supreme Court, the state is within its authority to do something like that in a situation like that. So it's really interesting. And the other reason why I brought this up is because even though this wasn't the actual topic for the presentation yesterday during the Q&A, a number of people were asking about the nature and extent of presidential authority in times of crisis. And so she talked a little bit about that and basically said what I said is that, obviously presidents have become a lot more powerful, especially, since FDR in the 1930s. But quite honestly, we really don't know how far a president's powers can extend, especially in a crisis situation like this. A lot of it is going to depend on what we're going to talk about in a few minutes, specifically how the courts respond to this, because as we'll talk about in a few minutes, ultimately it is up to the federal courts, and in the end, it is up to the US Supreme Court to decide what a particular passage of the Constitution says and means through this invented power that the courts created for themselves. We'll talk about that, called judicial review. So there you go. Really, we don't know. The president can do as much as he is allowed to do by the courts. So as I said, I'm hoping that the Hammer will get the recording of that Zoom up in a couple of days, and I'll send you that link as soon as I can, because I think it's really interesting. Sean Anthony says in the group chat, I agree with quarantine, but I think it's kind of messed up to deny access to the ocean as a source of food. It forces people to participate in grocery stores and mass consumption. I'm not quite clear on that. I think that I'm not sure if the Orange County beach closure would also affect people's ability to go onto piers and fish. The one thing that I will tell you is that if you are fishing at most of the beaches in Orange County, especially if you're fishing off the piers, I wouldn't be eating anything that I caught, because there are serious problems with the local fish populations in terms of mercury contamination, heavy metal contamination, that sort of thing. So you know what, I wouldn't be eating that stuff if I were you, because the long-term health effects are kind of dicey.
It also too, it feels like people are so short-sighted with respect to all of this, because it's not like we're saying forever and ever the rest of your life you live by the beach but you don't enjoy it. We're saying like for several weeks until we get this like life-threatening pandemic under control, please abstain from going to the beach. And so the lack of maturity as far as just being able to self-restrain for just a short period of time is pretty extraordinary.
And it's a really complicated issue. And obviously, there are some, I mean, again, it's a matter of trying, the courts and the governments trying as best they can to balance people's natural rights, their basic freedom of movement and that sort of thing, with the larger needs of society, especially of protecting public health and that sort of thing. And I think what complicates it here is the fact that, if you have significant numbers of people who are violating these shelter in place orders and are violating social distancing, and they're just gathering in large groups, not only does that potentially harm themselves, because, people can say, well, you know what, I have the right, I have the individual freedom. If I'm going to go ahead and take the risk of potentially exposing myself to that virus, I should have the freedom to do that. It's my health, it's my body, whatever, right? But what complicates this is the fact that if you have lots of people going out and, violating social distancing and doing all of these things, not only are they potentially hurting themselves, but they are potentially hurting other people as well. Because the whole point of this is, obviously there is no way that even if everybody, who was able to, could maintain, quarantine, maintain social distancing, there's no way that we can completely eliminate the virus, from our communities. It's impossible. We're going to have to wait for, a vaccine, more effective treatments, that sort of thing. But the basic purpose of this is, as we've talked about in here previously, is this notion of flattening the curve, right? Doing what we can do to make sure that the spread of the virus is as limited and controlled as it possibly could be, so that our existing healthcare infrastructure, which was already heavily stressed before all this started, doesn't become so overwhelmed that it collapses, right? So the idea here is that for the greater public good of not seeing our healthcare system collapse, this needs to be done. And here's the thing. The LA Orange County area is one of the hot spots for coronavirus. And so therefore the governor is saying, look, California, we need to maintain this for a while yet. We'll start opening things up gradually as soon as the experts say that we reasonably can. And it's really complicated. And I understand that. And I understand that there are, people who really, for their own emotional well-being, for their own mental health, just need to get out. But and for a while, but I also realize that, or I also recognize the fact that, let's face it, how we interact socially is going to change, not just in the short term, but in the medium term as well. Because let's face it, any gradual reopening of the economy here in California in particular, and in other states as well, it's going to be really gradual, and it's going to be really conditional, right? For example, I saw a story on, I forget which news show I was watching last night, and they were talking with an LA Times reporter who'd been researching this. And they were saying likely that theme parks like Disneyland are probably not going to reopen until 2021. And when they reopen, it's going to be a radically different experience from what we're used to. And they're talking about the possibility of, everyone having their temperature checked at the gates before they're admitted, that only a vastly small number of people will be admitted on a particular day. You may have to be masked, you may have to wear gloves, and all of this sort of thing. So, let's face it. While I get, the whole civil liberties thing, and I get our freedom of movement, I get natural rights and all that sort of thing, I think that we have to recognize that if we're going to get a handle on the virus and limit the spread and do all of these things until such time as a vaccine becomes a reality, and that's going to take a while, it's going to take a number of months, that, any reopening is going to be very gradual, and it's going to be very incomplete. And it's going to be hard for a lot of people. So, like we said, with our first major course theme, so much of what government does really is a balancing act, trying to deal with the whole freedom versus order thing. And we recognize that at any point in society, not everyone is going to agree. So there you go. Okay. So let me go ahead and pivot away from that for right now. And first of all, ask if there are any questions relating to the discussion that we had in here last week, talking about the presidency, or anything relating to that presidency discussion forum post that is due, not counting the grace period, at 11:59 p.m. tonight. So any remaining questions relevant specifically to the presidency before we go ahead and shift our attention to next week's stuff dealing with the judicial branch. Anybody? All right. So let's go ahead and move on. And we do want to go ahead, like I said, and talk a little bit at this point about the courts. And if you went ahead, I'm sorry, I have to reopen my judiciary notes here on my other screen. There we go. So, and again, I apologize for, the delay in getting these notes posted on Canvas. This is a work in progress. What can I tell you? So anyway, when you take a look at the judiciary notes, you will notice that they are blessedly more brief than either the notes on Congress, which seem to go on forever, right? Or the notes on the presidency as well. And I'll tell you about, and the fact that they are more brief is intentional. I'll explain the reasoning for that in a little bit. But what you also will notice when you take a look at the judiciary notes is that they follow the same pattern as was the case with both the Congress notes and the presidency notes. So basically, I begin by talking about the framers' attitude, the framers' perception towards the courts when they created the courts in Article 3 of the Constitution. And then I go on to help you understand a little bit about how the powers of the judicial branch have grown and evolved and really changed dramatically from the time of the framers until the present day. So we want to focus a little bit on that. And then towards the end of the judiciary notes, I talk a little bit, or I really emphasize the fact that really the judicial system that we have in the United States today, with a few variations here and there, most not very significant variations, and one very significant one that we'll talk about. But for the most part, our judicial system here in the United States is pretty much a duplicate, kind of a cut and paste job of the British judicial system. And I'll explain how and why that is in just a couple of minutes. So let's talk about a few of the highlights from the judiciary notes. And obviously, at any time, if you have questions, feel free to unmute your mic and ask, or if you'd rather put the question or the comment in the group chat, and that is fine as well. So now remember what we've been saying over the past couple of weeks, that, as the framers sat down to create our three national government branches, whether we're talking about Congress in Article 1, the presidency in Article 2, or the judiciary in Article 3, the framers had, very specific ideas. They had fairly specific visions for each of the three national government branches, and they had some kind of predictions in mind about how each of the three branches would develop in terms of their level of power and what the power relationship amongst the three national government branches should look like. Remember the fact that we emphasized a couple of weeks ago that in general, the framers believed that if this separation of powers system that they were creating for under our new Constitution was going to work, then all three branches, Congress, the president, and the courts, would all have to have roughly the same equal level of power and authority. Because if one branch dominates over the other two, separation of powers breaks down, and the possibility of abuse by the federal government grows exponentially. But remember what we said. How the framers perceived each of the three national government branches tends to be very different from how we tend to perceive them in the year 2020. And that exclusively is the fault of the framers. It's the decision that the framers made in creating Congress, the president, and the courts in the way that they did in 1787 that caused us to get from there to here. So with Congress, remember, the framers thought that Congress would be the most powerful and most dangerous branch. That's not how we see Congress today. What accounts for the difference? Well, we talked about it, right? The framers were so scared of the possibility of Congress abusing its power that they really successfully boxed Congress in Article 1. They very carefully specified what Congress could and could not do. And in doing so, they went too far. They made Congress too weak. And that's why we have the Congress that we have today. Same thing with the presidency. Because if you went through the presidency notes carefully, you'll notice that, the framers really weren't all that worried about the potential for the president to spin out of control and abuse its power. They were much more scared about Congress. So the framers did not sweat the details with the president in the same way that they did with Congress. Article 2, much more brief, much more vague. And as we talked about last week, and as it was in the notes from last week for the presidency, that lack of detail in Article 2 allows modern presidents, starting with FDR, to essentially invent new powers for themselves. And when they're told, hey, Mr. President, you can't do that, that's not mentioned in Article 2, the president could say, well, Article 2 may not say that I can do this thing, but it also doesn't clearly say that I can't, right? And so that is one of the keys to the significant, the dramatic, almost exponential growth in presidential authority that we've seen starting with FDR and going on up to the present day with our 45th president, Donald Trump, right? Now, guess what? Same thing with Congress, with the judiciary. If you look at the top of your judiciary notes, look what it says there in Roman numeral number 1. It says that the framers believed that the national government judiciary would be the least dangerous of the three national government branches, posing little or no possibility of becoming too powerful or abusing that power to threaten people's natural rights. So the framers weren't scared of the courts at all. Okay, the framers believed that the courts had almost zero potential of becoming too powerful and abusing their power. And that's one of the reasons why, if you are able to look at a copy of Article 1 dealing with Congress side by side with Article 2 dealing with the president, side by side with Article 3 dealing with the courts, what you will notice is that Article 3 is barely there. Article 3 is extremely short and extremely vague, right? Some constitutional historians half-jokingly suggest that the framers actually wrote Article 3 one night during happy hour in one of the pubs they used to frequent in downtown Philadelphia during the Constitutional Convention. Why? Article 3 is so short, they argue, that it could have been written on the back of a cocktail napkin, right? It's barely there. Now, chances are that didn't happen, right? Chances are Article 3 was not written on the back of a cocktail napkin, though it really is fun to imagine that it was. But what that does tell us is that, it shows the framers' complete lack of concern about the courts because they just didn't feel the need to sweat the details. And in part, that's because they didn't fear the courts abusing its power, But as the notes also go on to suggest, the other reason why the framers just didn't sweat the details at all with Article 3 was because the framers all pretty much assumed that the US court system would essentially be a cut and paste job of the British court system. Now, I want to explain that for just a minute, because when you first hear me say that, or when you first encounter that in the notes, that may sound weird. And that might sound kind of discordant to you. That might sound like it kind of conflicts with some important stuff that we talked about regarding the Constitution at the beginning of the semester. Because think back to the beginning of the semester, right? When we were face to face talking about the Constitution. And remember one message that I kept, repeating again and again and again until you were probably sick of it, right? And that was to say that in just about every aspect of the creation of both the Articles of Confederation, our first Constitution, and our current Constitution in 1787, the framers did everything that they possibly could to make our governmental system as distinct from, as different from the British governmental system as they could, right? Why? Because they were totally scared of the British political system. They felt like it was totally dysfunctional, and it allowed the national government to too easily abuse people and take away people's natural rights, okay? So, and I gave you lots of examples at the time, right? So for example, British political system features fusion of powers, right? So the US political system under the Constitution went the opposite way, separation of powers. Another example, in the British political system, they have what we call a unitary form of government. There is only one sovereign level of government in Britain, that is the national government. Local governments, county governments, town governments are all part of the national government in Britain. We don't do it that way. We do the opposite, right? So in the US, we have federalism. We have two sovereign levels of government in the United States, the sovereign national government and the 50 sovereign state governments. So we talked about all these examples early on in the semester about how the framers did everything they could to differentiate our governmental system from the British, because they feared the British system so much. And so that's why, fast forward to right now, it may at first sound really weird when I tell you, oh, well, the framers, they didn't worry about putting much detail into Article 3 because they just assumed that our court system would be a copy and paste job of the British court system. You might think, well, the framers are being really inconsistent here. And they are and they're not. Let me kind of give you the explanation, and I talk about this in the notes as well. See, the framers, the British judicial system, the British courts, was the only part of the British governmental model that they actually liked, that they actually trusted. Why? Because if you think back to the colonial period, right? If you think back to when we were a series of 13 British colonies, the American colonists had all these problems with the British king. They had all these problems with the British Parliament, but they did not have problems with the British courts. They believed that the British courts were the only part of the British government that was actually fair and that was actually trying to do right by the colonists as well as do right by all British citizens wherever they lived. So they trusted the British courts. They didn't trust any other element of the British government. That's why, if you look at how our executive and legislative branches are organized, totally different than the British model. But that's also why the framers were so very comfortable with just simply assuming that our court system would be a variation of the British judicial model. And their reasoning was simple. Well, if that's going to happen, if our court system is just going to be a cut and paste job from the British model, we just don't need to throw in a lot of details into Article 3. We assume this is going to happen, right? And that's what they did. Plus, they didn't fear the courts. They didn't see the courts spinning out of control and abusing its power because the British courts never did. So does that make sense? So does everybody understand, why the framers just weren't worried about the courts in general, and specifically why the framers just didn't bother to put a lot of detail about the structure and function of the courts into Article 3? So questions, comments? Yeah, go ahead, Allison.
It makes total sense. I was also going to say too, just the nature of the judicial system in general doesn't necessarily lend itself to power abuse. I mean, like, it's all about finding like the most equitable conclusion. So the people that are going to be drawn to that system and the people that are going to be functioning within that system aren't necessarily of the same sort of tendency as people who are going to be generating laws and enforcing laws. Like, that's a totally different mindset and personality type as well.
Yeah, and if you are a true believer in separation of powers and checks and balances, as the framers obviously were, that that fits really nicely with what you're saying. And so there really isn't that worry, because remember, and part of this, I have to say too, the framers had, I guess I would say, a rather overly optimistic attitude towards the courts. They kind of saw the judicial system through kind of rose-colored glasses, if that makes sense. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But but here's the thing: the framers knew via separation of powers and checks and balances that it would be really hard for the courts to spin out of control and abuse their authority too much. Why? Because here's the thing: the courts can make whatever decision the courts want to make, but because of separation of powers and checks and balances, the courts are unable to enforce their own decisions. So who is responsible for enforcing all national government laws and all national government court decisions? The president, right? The executive branch. And so the framers said, problem solved, right? We don't need to worry about the courts spinning out of control, because if the courts ever act in an abusive fashion, the executive branch can basically step in and say, hey, guess what, courts? I think you've lost your minds, right? I think you're off your rockers here. I think you're trying to be abusive. So you know what? I refuse. The executive branch refuses to enforce your decisions, and now you're stuck. Now, with separation of powers and checks and balances, not only can the president foil the courts by refusing to enforce their decisions, but Congress, if they wanted to get really extreme, could put the courts out of business tomorrow. Why? Because the courts don't fund their own operations. Congress allocates money for the court's operations every year. So if Congress wanted to stop an abusive federal court in their tracks, all they have to do is take away their budget, eliminate the money. They got to close, right? So because the framers were such fervent believers in separation of powers and checks and balances, that's yet another reason. I should probably add that into the notes, make the judiciary notes longer for the poor people in summer session. Oh, well, that's life. That's yet another reason why the framers just weren't worried about the courts abusing their power. Now, unfortunately, again, like I said, I think that the framers made some overly optimistic assumptions about the courts going forward. The framers did everything they could to try and shield the federal courts from partisan politics as much as they possibly could, right? That's why federal court judges, now it's different in most states, including California, and their state judicial systems, but in the federal court system, judges aren't elected by the people, right? Judges are appointed by the president, confirmed by the US Senate for lifetime terms in office. And the framers took those steps to try, as I said, to insulate federal judges from the influence of partisan politics, political ideology, that sort of thing. Because the framers' fear was, if we were to allow the voters, there we are back to their distrust of the voters again, right? So that if we allow the voters to elect federal judges, if we were to allow the voters to elect judges on the US Supreme Court, the judges would lose their judicial independence. They would be pressured to make decisions not based on logical, dispassionate, nonpartisan legal reasoning. Instead, they would want to make very politicized decisions that were consistent with majority opinions in society, because judges would then have a re-election obsession like everybody else, like members of Congress do, like the president does, like every elected official in this country does, right? And so the framers said, oh, we took care of this problem, right? Judges will not make politicized decisions. They will not make overly ideological decisions, because we have sufficiently insulated federal judges, you know, from partisanship and hyper-partisanship and all this kind of stuff. Well, guess what? That's bull, right? The framers were dead wrong there. Because if you look at how the courts have evolved, the federal courts have evolved in the United States over time, you know that they have become more and more and more partisan, more and more ideological as time goes on. And what we see now, what we've seen in the past several decades, but we see especially now, is that, you know, there could be a real potential for the courts to abuse their power, especially if a majority of judges on the US Supreme Court share a core political ideology with a majority of folks in Congress and with the president at the time, right? And in a sense, we almost have that now. We virtually have that situation now, because a majority of judges on the US Supreme Court now are clearly conservative, right? And there's no disputing that fact, okay? Especially with, you know, the last two appointments by President Trump, Justice Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh, that's clear. We have the strongest conservative majority on the court than we've had in probably 75 or 100 years, okay?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So with FDR, there was a majority Democratic Senate and House,
Yep.
and that's how he was able to get the New Deal policies into law.
Yep.
So anytime that there's like a party majority in the president, House, and Senate, that leads to presidential power increase?
Most of the time, not always. And I really appreciate your example. Now, the interesting thing about the example that you cite is it's a little different from the way it is now, in the sense that you're right. FDR was a Democrat. Both houses of Congress had big Democratic majorities, and that makes sense, right? Voters at the time in the 1930s, you know, they all fairly or unfairly blamed the Republican Party and a Republican president, Herbert Hoover, for causing the Great Depression, which they didn't, by the way. But, you know, if you're the party in power, bad things happen, you get blamed for it. That's just the way it is with American voters, right? Rightly or wrongly. So you had a Democratic president in FDR. You had huge Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress, but a majority of judges on the US Supreme Court at the time were old line Southern conservative Republican judges. And so initially, once FDR and the democratically controlled Congress starts passing all this relatively radical New Deal legislation to try and kickstart the economy, bring us out of the Depression, people would challenge those new laws in court. They would go to the US Supreme Court, and the US Supreme Court would summarily strike them down. So for the first year or so, of all of this, FDR and the democratically controlled Congress got really frustrated because they couldn't get anything done. They'd pass these new laws and the Supreme Court strike them down one by one by one by one in rapid succession. Why? Because the old Southern conservatives on the Supreme Court, thought that FDR was some kind of communist. Say, no, we're not doing any of this stuff. Forget it. So what happened? Well, the Republican majority on the Supreme Court at the time had a sudden change of heart. Why? Did they have suddenly, the clouds lifted and they realized, oh my God, we're wrong. FDR is right. And they openly embraced FDR's policies? No. FDR played power politics with them. Because here's the thing. As we know, right now, there are 9 judges on the U.S. Supreme Court, right? But guess what? That's not written into the Constitution. In Article 3, because it's so vague, all it says about the Supreme Court, there shall be one U.S. Supreme Court and whatever other inferior courts Congress chooses to create. So they left a lot of decisions, the framers left a lot of decisions about what the federal court system would look like to Congress, including it's up to Congress to decide how many judges there should be on the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, it's been 9 for quite some time, but it hasn't always been. When the first U.S. Supreme Court in 1789 had 6 members, 6 judges. Now, that made no sense. An even number. What happens if they tie? How do they break a tie? Do they play rock, paper, scissors? They flip a coin. What do they do? Really weird. So there were 9 judges in the 1930s. And so basically, FDR, when he got frustrated with the Supreme Court striking down all his new laws, he said, okay, here's what we're going to do. I'm putting a proposal in front of Congress. We are going to double the size of the U.S. Supreme Court. We're going to take it from 9 to 18 judges. And his idea was then he was going to appoint, and the democratically controlled Senate would confirm 9 very liberal, progressive judges who would uphold these New Deal laws. So he would create a new liberal majority on the U.S. Supreme Court. And he had huge Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress, so that the conservative judges on the Supreme Court saw the writing on the wall. They realized that they were about to lose all their power. And so suddenly, they stopped striking down FDR's new laws, and they started allowing them to continue. They started to approve them. Constitutional historians call this dramatic change of heart on the part of the U.S. Supreme Court, the switch in time that saved 9, meaning the 9 judges on the U.S. Supreme Court at the time. So, yeah. So the federal courts are a whole lot more politicized, especially today, than the framers ever thought they would be. So that was one area where the framers' vision, wasn't probably as clear, as sharp as it should have been.
Do you think the framers assumed that we would maintain sort of a congruent perspective as far as what we wanted as a nation? Because it seems like the framers constructed everything in terms of all of us agreeing that we were moving forward with one similar ideology, and yet the difference between like a conservative perspective versus a more liberal perspective is so extreme now on so many significant points that it seems like we're not even moving in the same direction.
Yeah, partisan and ideological polarization, right? Yeah. And I could get off on a whole riff about this in terms of, how the polarization now has gotten so bad that it's even prevented Congress and the president from acting in a decisive fashion in a national crisis. That never used to happen. Previous national crises, Republicans and Democrats would bicker and they would argue, but ultimately they would come together and they would compromise in meaningful ways because the future of the country is at stake. That's not happening now. That shows you how bad, how severe polarization has gotten, right? And the framers, I think, at the time, even though they wouldn't have known about this, it didn't exist back then. There was an idea in modern political science that we call median voter theory, which is now blown out of the water. But what median voter theory says is that in the United States, the average American voter tends to be very moderate, not polarized. And that was true in the United States for a very long time in our political history. How I said that for a long time, the difference between Republicans and Democrats was kind of like the difference between vanilla ice cream versus French vanilla ice cream. But we know that's not the case anymore. So yeah, I think that the framers designed the system under this assumption of a median voter, of a moderate American voter being the standard. And that just isn't the case anymore for a variety of reasons. Now, what I do want to do, because we're almost out of time officially, though obviously I'm happy to stay on longer if you're available to do so, or if you want to do so, if you're not thoroughly sick of me by now. But anyway, I do want to make sure that I mention in the last couple of minutes that we have officially in the class kind of the big game changer for the courts. Because as I said, the framers assumed weak court system, like the British, that sort of thing. And they put almost no detail into Article 3 as a result. Well, guess what? Today, pretty much nobody in the United States would say that the courts are the least powerful and the least dangerous of the three branches, right? Now, that distinction belongs to Congress, as we've talked about, right? But what caused the federal courts in general and the Supreme Court in particular to become exponentially more powerful in the US than they originally were in the time of the framers? It was a power that the Supreme Court in particular invented for itself fairly shortly after our current Constitution became law, because our current Constitution becomes law in 1789. And then in 1803, the Supreme Court, under its second Chief Justice, a guy by the name of John Marshall, essentially invented this huge game-changing power for the US Supreme Court that we call judicial review. And as I talk about in the judiciary notes, judicial review, it has two basic components, right? The first element of judicial review gives the courts the ability to essentially interpret the actual words of the Constitution. In the end, it becomes the responsibility of the courts to tell us what the framers meant when they wrote certain things into the Constitution. So that's the first component of judicial review. The courts have the last word on what the Constitution actually means. Okay. Now, folks, that in itself is a huge power, right? Because as we've said, the Constitution governs every aspect of our political lives in the United States, every aspect of what government does and how government does it. So to say that the federal courts in general, and in the end, the 9 judges on the Supreme Court in particular, have complete authority over what the Constitution means, that's huge, right? And then there's the second element of judicial review, which is just as huge, because think about it. Once the courts have the authority to interpret the actual words of the Constitution and to tell us what they mean in practice, then the courts automatically have the ability to essentially strike down any governmental action, any action by the federal government, so any action of the president, any action of Congress, or any action of the state governments. the courts can take those actions and strike them down, kill them. And all they have to say is, guess what? This action that was just taken by some aspect of the government, we believe this action is in conflict with what the Constitution says. So if the
But-
president, oh, go
Sorry,
ahead.
but all
ahead.
9 of the judges on the Supreme Court have to agree. No,
Just a
just the
majority.
majority. Got it.
5-4 will do you.
Got it.
Right? And that's why, by the way, President Trump's 2 Supreme Court appointments during his first term, Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, were such game changers, because what that guarantees in most cases, not in all cases, because occasionally the Chief Justice, John Roberts, will sometimes flip. He's not consistently, reliably conservative on every issue the court deals with. Occasionally he'll surprise us, right? For example, he was the deciding vote in preventing the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, from being struck down a few years ago, which shocked everybody, especially a lot of conservatives, but whatever. But those 2 appointments are key, because in probably 85 to 95% of the cases that come before the U.S. Supreme Court, it guarantees a 5-4 conservative majority on most court decisions. Okay. So 5-4 is all you need, right? So you get the idea that this invented power of judicial review, because guess what? You can go through all of Article 3. You can go through all of the entire Constitution. Nowhere are the words judicial review used. The power does not formally exist in the Constitution. How does it happen? Well, in a famous Supreme Court case in 1803, the U.S. Supreme Court said, well, guess what? Article 3 may not say that we can do this specifically, but it doesn't say that we can't. So they invented this power essentially for themselves. Now, there's a lot of historical debate about this, by the way. A lot of folks say that the framers themselves intended for the courts to be able to exercise this power of judicial review, but they thought it so obvious that they didn't feel the need to specify it in Article 3. And I'm real mixed on that one. I'm not sure that the framers were all that convinced at the time, especially because, remember, the framers assumed that the federal courts in the U.S. would follow the same pattern and practice and process and structure as the British courts did. And the British courts do not have that power. In the British system, in most cases, judicial review is a power that's held by Parliament and the Prime Minister, not the courts. So I think that argument that the framers assumed that the courts would do this, it was so obvious they didn't need to write it down. I think that's kind of iffy, but that's just me. That's one political scientist's opinion. So take it for what it's worth, right? So judicial review, like I say, it is the absolute game changer, especially in a situation where the stars line up for one major political party, and you have the same party controlling the White House, controlling Congress, and essentially controlling the Supreme Court majority. And if you've got that, in most cases, and again, there's always exceptions, but in most cases, it's going to end up benefiting that party. For example, the Supreme Court decision in the very controversial case of Bush versus Gore. And this was the challenge that went to the Supreme Court over the results of the 2000 presidential election, which were very close. There were all these disputed ballots in Florida, and basically a lawsuit was filed that went to the Supreme Court, basically saying that the federal government unfairly shut down necessary voter recounts in Florida and in a couple of other states, and that the election was unfair. And the Supreme Court, in an unprecedented decision, basically decided the results of the 2000 presidential election. The conservative majority on the Supreme Court, and at the time, in 2000, Republicans controlled Congress, and they controlled the Supreme Court. And so the Supreme Court said, you know, no more recounts. The Supreme Court in the Bush v. Gore decision actually declared George W. Bush the winner of the 2000 presidential election. Now, that was unprecedented. No Supreme Court had ever weighed into an election in that way before, right? But the decision had to be accepted. Why? Well, there was no higher authority to appeal to. You can't go and say, well, the Supreme Court, you don't have the authority to do this under the Constitution because there's no one above them to appeal to, right? So that shows you how this can work. So any remaining questions, comments about
Can we
any
talk
of
more
this
about
stuff?
the New Deal and how it set new precedents for the presidential power?
I mean, basically, there aren't a lot of specific example. There's a couple of things, right? Because basically what a lot of the New Deal laws did is they established the ability of the federal government in general and the president in particular to be able to attempt to regulate the U.S. economy. So, for example, the FDIC was created, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which required banks to have, really hefty cash reserves on hand so that if another economic crisis happened, there wouldn't be a run on the banks and the banks wouldn't collapse and all these things wouldn't happen. And so for the first time, the president is able to, and Congress are able to create laws designed to try and regulate the U.S. economy. And no one had ever thought that the president or Congress should have that power previously, because previous to the Great Depression and the New Deal, there really wasn't a quote unquote national economy in the US. There was a series of relatively disconnected state level economies. But one of the big lessons that FDR learned from the Great Depression was that the US economy had changed so much, and that it was now truly one unified national economy. And so what FDR tried to do with a lot of New Deal laws and a lot of subsequent economic regulations that happened after the fact is that FDR was trying to be able to control the US economy sufficiently that we would no longer have these regular cycles of incredible boom followed by incredible bust in the economy. He wanted to be able to put limits on the economy so that we would have, instead of the big, wild economic gyrations, that we would have steady, consistent, maybe boring levels of economic growth. And obviously, there's no way that any economic regulation is ever going to assure that for all time. But that was what FDR was trying to do. So that was one of the big areas where presidential authority, opens up. But I give you a few other examples since FDR in the president notes of these invented powers that modern presidents have created for themselves through the lack of detail in Article 2. And one of the big game changers there was the executive order power. That is the ability of the president to essentially make laws without bothering with the U.S. Congress. And if you kind of skipped over that part in the notes, you might want to go back and take a look at that in the presidency notes. Okay. So any other questions, comments, problems about the judiciary, about the presidency, before we go ahead? And I'm happy to stick around for a while for kind of the after class chat. But any questions about anything specifically having to do with the course material before we go ahead and segue, into, I guess, what you might call the coffee hour or something like that? Anything at all?
FDR, he had an executive order. Was that the first one in the country?
Yeah.
Had to do with discrimination in the defense industry.
Yeah. He was probably the first one to use it, though he wasn't the first one to really use it in a meaningful way. More subsequent presidents, you start seeing a much greater use of executive orders, starting with President Eisenhower in the 1950s. And the really interesting aspect of that is that, a lot of people, well, I shouldn't say a lot of people, but a lot of conservatives argue that it's only liberal democratic presidents that are power hungry and seek to increase their power dramatically. And of course, they always point to FDR, right? Well, guess what? Eisenhower was a Republican, and he actively used the executive order to try and enforce U.S. Supreme Court decisions protecting the civil rights of African Americans. So, for example, after the U.S. Supreme Court in 1954 passed made the decision in Brown versus Board of Education, and basically struck down the creation of separate public schools based on race. So you had, one set of public schools for Caucasian students, and then a second separate set of public schools that were inferior in just about every way for students of color, right? And the Supreme Court in 54 said, you can't do that because that violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Says, all individuals living in the United States are entitled to equal treatment, equal protection under the law. So they basically ended discrimination on the basis of race in that sense. Now, a lot of school districts in a number of states, especially the southern states, the states of the former Confederacy, said, we don't care what the Supreme Court says. We don't believe the Supreme Court has authority over us. So guess what? We're maintaining separate public schools on the basis of race, and we don't care. So Eisenhower, who's president in 54, waits a while to see if states are going to comply with the Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board. And when they don't, he sends in the National Guard. And he sends in U.S. Army troops in some cases to forcibly desegregate public schools in places like Topeka, Kansas, right? So there you go. So it's really interesting. And that's why if you look back at the presidency notes, what I tell you is starting with FDR, and I mentioned this in the Zoom last week, every modern president, including and since FDR, doesn't matter what party they are, doesn't matter how conservative or liberal they are, every modern president has taken steps to significantly increase their power and authority. It's not a partisan thing. It's not an ideological thing. It's just a modern president thing. Okay. So anybody else? Okay. So, that's where we're going to end the formal portion of the class today. If anyone wants to stick around for a few minutes just to chat, I am happy to do so. But remember, your president discussion forum post is due tonight, 11:59 p.m. plus the 3-day grace period. And of course, the discussion forum post on the courts, which I haven't actually posted yet. I will post that a little later today, and that will be due next Friday at 11:59 p.m. So we will go from there. So I will see you all next week for more of this lovely stuff. And now, if you want to stick around and chat, I am happy to do so. So have a great week. Be safe. Take care. and I'll see you all soon.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Oh, thank you. It's
That's
always
awesome.
it's always my pleasure.
What made you go into political science and not into law?
Well, I was never really all that motivated to be a lawyer. You know, my viewpoint is, and Sean Anthony just logged off, and I think he has law school in his future, so I'm glad he's not here to hear this. My viewpoint is we got too many lawyers in the United States, right? I mean, per capita, the number of lawyers is just incredible. And the number, I saw a statistic a few years ago about the number of non-practicing attorneys in the United States. So people who got a law degree, they got a JD, maybe even took the bar exam, but don't practice. It's just huge. There's way too many lawyers. It's part of the reason why we are such an overly litigious society, in my view. And that's just not what interested me anyway. I fell in love with political science because of political science, just generally. You know, I had, and I think I mentioned this last week, right? I mean, my first political science experience in college was horrible. My poli-sci 1 experience was awful. I hated it. I thought, oh my God, because I was a business major back then. It's like, oh, forget this stuff. Who wants to deal with it? But then, you know, for whatever reason, I took another poli-sci course as a general education course, our equivalent of poli-sci 2 here at LBCC. And I just fell in love with the instructor, kind of the issues we were talking about. And I just thought, wow, you know, I want to just, you know, bury myself in this stuff. And that's kind of how it happened. So, yeah, but never once did the thought of, oh, I should go to law school and get a JD. Never once did that pop into my head. It just wasn't on my radar. And then, and you know, and that's a great career for a lot of other people, but it just wasn't
yours.
It just wasn't my motivation at all. So you know,
Interesting. I see there's just so many overlaps.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. There absolutely are. And there are, you know, a number of folks who teach political science, especially in community colleges, who, you know, that's their preparation. They have a JD, and that's great. My only thing about that is I sometimes worry that, you know, their academic preparation isn't quite broad enough, because obviously if you have a JD and you look at the courses that you've taken as part of your JD, it's all very narrowly related to different aspects of the law, which is great, but the law isn't the only aspect of our political system. So, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, it's my pleasure.
I am gonna jump off so I can go do the discussion post.
Okay, great.
Thanks, guys.
So have a great weekend.
Thank
as
you.
great a weekend as we can have right
that's
now,
all
right?
good. Yeah,
I know.
exactly. Bye, guys.
Have a good weekend and
You
a whole
too.
week.
Oh,
Have a
and
good
Sarah,
week.
are you wearing a Cal State LA t-shirt? I thought I noticed
Oh
that.
no, it's Long Beach.
Oh, it's Long Beach. Okay,
Yeah.
well, I saw Cal State, so well, you're
Yeah.
repping for
No,
your-
I
for
haven't
your-
gotten it yet, but I
Okay.
will eventually.
Absolutely. All right. Well, have a great weekend. And unless there's anything else you want to chat about right now.
Oh no.
Okay, super. So take care, be safe, and I'll see you next week.
All right. Bye. Have a good week.
You too. Bye-bye.